Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming back for day 4 for Procurement 101. I am Cora Anthony, the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center. So thank you again for joining us. It's been my pleasure to be with you guys. Just as per usual, a quick disclaimer. Let me just let everybody in. I don't know if you guys
I'm trying to do it too. I'm trying to help you, my girl.
Oh, thank you. There we go. But a quick disclaimer, this virtual training provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. So if you do have any particular questions, just like we've been doing, please feel free to pop them into the chat. I will get them to Ms. Cheryl as soon as we can. And she's going to do all the due diligence to get you the best possible answer. So we've been using the same platform all week. So we know that if you are on the web browser, if you hover your mouse, this bar will appear where you can turn your camera on, turn it off, and then if necessary, mute and unmute, but more importantly, the chat function icon so that you can pop in any questions, comments that you have into the chat. Okay. If you are like me and you are on the desktop app, then you're going to see that same bar on the top right corner next to the leave button. So same features, turn your cameras on and off, mute and unmute yourself. And again, most importantly, the chat box option. So there, just any comments, any questions, concerns that you may have, please feel free to drop them in there. I've already gone ahead and dropped the link to the materials there if you don't have it already. And with that said, I'm leaving the agenda there. You guys also have access to the agenda on the webpage with all the materials. So if you feel a question coming up, just peruse the agenda just a little bit because it might be covered either later on today or in tomorrow's final session. Okay, so without further ado, Ms. Cheryl, I'm going to stop presenting and pass the baton off to you. Take it away. I think we lost Cheryl. It's okay, she'll join again. So usually the share button is right next to the leave button, so that might happen. So give us 1 minute while we get Cheryl back with us, and then she will begin. Let me see, I think I see her join. There she is, she's calling in. There she is. You're on mute, you're on mute. You're on mute.
That's going to be our glitch for the day.
There you go. No, I was just telling them the share button is right next to the leave button. So if you don't hover correctly, it's happened to me plenty of times. I accidentally kicked myself out. But
well, thank goodness you were inviting me. I was trying to get.
yeah.
Thank you. Okay, let's try this again. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes, ma'am.
Yay. Okay.
There we go.
Okay, day 4. We made it. One more to go. Happy December again. Mr. Charlie Schultz here and Peanuts. I actually grew up with the guy that did all these drawings. Well, I didn't grow up with him, his daughter, so I knew him. Used to go to his house when I was little. Welcome and good afternoon. Sending up smoke and prayers. Hope you guys are all safe and healthy. My information, if you guys need it, and brought to you courtesy of the Native Learning Center. Remember, we're being recorded. I think you guys all know who I am, so I'm gonna run through this part and our objectives. Hopefully you'll know what they are by now. Today, we're gonna hit on non-competitive methods, quotation evaluations, suspension and debarment, Indian preference requirements, procurement principles and standards, and price and cost analysis. Again, there's some good information in here. Your Indian preference stuff, 5, 6, and 7, you might want to have that for that section. And all the way to, hopefully you guys looked at some more Davis-Bacon Labor Standards Desk Guide, which was 29. Which brings me to the question that I couldn't answer. I did, I guess, answer it correctly when I said this is what I would assume, but I called the HUD office and got a hold of them and did some more research. Just because I wasn't really familiar with every piece of guidance, and there was quite a few of them issued in the last 2 years that had anything to do with CARES Act or American Rescue Plan funding. The HUD response is that Davis-Bacon still applies to those funds. It's still part of the abbreviated IHP that you submit. They checked, and I went through and read several of the implementation notices, and that requirement was not waived. So that's our answer for yesterday's question. Non-competitive methods. My husband was a trap net fisherman for like 26 years up on the Great Lakes. This is a trap net boat, the one of the ones that he worked on. So you guys have never seen any of those. So non-competitive proposals. When would they when would they be allowable, basically, is your question. Is your item is available only from one person? There's only one source that even manufactures it. You have a public exigency or emergency for the requirement, and it'll not permit that delay resulting from a competitive solicitation. Your federal awarding agency or pass-through entity expressly authorizes that non-competitive proposals in response to a written request, and that's the key there. If you have to use this method, you have to put in a written request, and you ask for their permission, then you ask them to put it in writing, and you put it in your procurement file for further use, because it might be three years. That person might not be there by the time your monitoring comes around. Always, if you get permission to do something from HUD, even your auditor or whatever, take a copy of that email. Don't go searching for it, and stick it in the procurement file. It'll save you headaches down the road. So after solicitation of a number of sources, you can't, that competition is deemed inadequate. So that non-competitive method could be used only in extraordinary situations, only when other methods are infeasible. Often requires, that's not often, does require special approval from HUD. Must document reasons for use. So even when you do it, this is why I had to. Under very certain, very limited circumstances, procurement of $10,000 and more can be made without soliciting quotes. Those circumstances would include sole sourcing. Again, the same things we just went through, only available from one single source. The repair of a computer can only be done by perhaps that manufacturer. Emergency, it poses an immediate threat to your health or safety of a resident. An immediate threat to your building structure. Examples include a heating system, failure during a cold condition, or broken water pipe. The emergency will not permit a delay resulting from, running that competitive solicitation. That federal award agency or pass-through entity expressly authorizes that non-competitive proposal in response to your written request. And you have inadequate competition after solicitation of a number of prices, quotes, or bids. Competition is determined inadequate. That's the one that I ended up happening. That non-competitive method, you then would negotiate with that single source, provide preferences when feasible. A cost analysis is still actually required to make sure that they're not gouging you. What HUD may want when its approval is required is proof of that cost analysis. It may request to review all your procurement materials prior to the award of that contract, and written reasons why award cannot be made through competition. So be prepared to argue your story. To help fund a housing development project, the Elk Mountain Tribe is considering applying for your Indian Community Development Block Grant. To do this, they need to hire a consultant to help them with the ICDBG application. The tribal administrator suggests contacting Wilson Consultants to draft an RFP because they provided assistance writing their ICDBG application a few years ago. Is it allowable? And under what circumstances would it be allowable? Ooh, geez, nothing like showing you the answer, guys. Hey, it's because I'm like that, and I can't see my chat. That's my problem. I don't want to lose you either. So, what are they saying? Is anybody answering?
Not yet.
Not yet. Somebody put in the chat box. Is it allowable? Can the tribal administrator contact Wilson Consultants to draft that RFP?
Okay, Beth says it's a yes, but Deborah says it's a no.
Anybody else?
No.
Okay. So the next question, we got a yes and a no, and your next question is under what circumstance would it not be allowable? So the answer is yes, because Wilson's previous work is not related to this particular project. Under what circumstances would it not be allowable? Let's see if somebody answers. And congratulations to the correct answerer.
While they pop answers in the chat, can you present the whole slide, Cheryl?
Yeah, I'm sorry I did that. How's that?
There we go. Thank you. Okay, so we see Deborah says no if they're being considered, and Beth says same work related.
Okay. And the answer is?
And David shared it's a conflict of interest.
Okay. Per 2 CFR 203.19, Wilson would not be allowed to help the tribe with that RFP if he was planning on submitting a proposal related to that RFP. Or if Wilson did end up providing assistance writing the RFP, he would not be allowed to submit a proposal to help the tribe with the application. Here we go. Now, quotation evaluations. Price reasonableness. Before making an award, your contracting officer is supposed to determine that your proposed price is fair and reasonable. For most small purchases, price analysis is sufficient to make that determination. In cases where your housing entity purchased services or items from a non-commercial nature, like a special training course designed for your employees, or something that you just can't buy off of a shelf, submission of a cost detail and a cost analysis could be needed. So micro purchasing, that price analysis normally consists of comparing your quoted price to prices that you've recently paid for the same or a similar item. You can look again like at a price list for that one, your catalog prices, the signature, that contracting officer on your purchase order or contract signifies that they determine that that price is reasonable. So if you're the contracting officer, once you sign that, that means you've done your due diligence and you believe and you've conducted that price analysis based on prior purchases of a similar nature or sources of information. That's when I always say, waste the ink, put a copy of, whatever in there that shows it's in the same ballpark. Other small purchases above that micro purchase level, generally price analysis is going to consist of a comparison of quotations to each other and to other sources of pricing information that you paid that very similar in the past. Again, you can go to that catalog. If you only get one response, that your contracting officer should include a statement of reasonableness in the contract file. That statement can be based on market research, comparison of the proposed price with prices that you found reasonable on other previous purchases, current price lists, catalogs, advertisements, a comparison with similar items in a related industry. The contracting officer's personal knowledge at the time of the purchase compared to that ice, or any other reasonable basis. Only in rare cases would your contracting officer conduct a cost analysis, a non-commercial type purchase unique to your, housing needs, such as a training course. So your other factors, if using price and other factors to determine that award, your contracting officer has broad discretion in fashioning the evaluation procedures that they're going to use. In those situations, your contracting officer should ensure that quotations can be evaluated in an efficient and minimally unburdensome fashion. Competitive proposal type procedures, formal evaluations, determining competitive ranges, conducting detailed negotiations, requesting best and final offers should not be used for small purchases. Your contracting officer can use information such as their knowledge of, again, previous experience with that supplier service that you're purchasing, your vendor's past performance for your housing entity, or customer surveys to evaluate that quotation. Evaluating contractor responsibility. Your housing entity must make awards, again, that responsive, and responsive. I'm sorry, responsive and responsible that you're supposed to look at whenever you're working with a contractor. Processing the ability to perform successfully under the terms and conditions of your proposed procurement. When it's a small purchase where payment is generally made only after full delivery or completion of the job, your contracting officer has broad latitude in evaluating the contractor responsibility, including the personal knowledge of past experience or the relationship you've got existing with that vendor. Your signature, your contracting officer, again, on your purchase order or that contract signifies that that's their determination of responsibility, and they find it or they deem it satisfactory. So documentation, your housing entity has to maintain records in sufficient detail to show the history of every procurement action that you take, basically. Document, I guess, and maybe buy your own printer and copier in there. Make such documentation is particularly important in the event that there should be a protest lodged ever against your housing entity. It'll facilitate future purchases of similar supplies or services, since it will not be necessary to recreate those solicitation documents. Supporting documentation shall be in writing and placed within your procurement file. These records shall include, but shall not necessarily be limited to, the following. And before I go to the next slide, I went into the procurement office and I'm like, what? I can't make heads or scribble all over, well, I shouldn't show you my pad because it's just as bad. But it's like, I need you to take the time at the end of the day to use a fresh pad and whatever, or type it on your thing and print it, something that will make sense to somebody besides you. She could decipher it, but you have to make sure that somebody else looking at your documents would understand what they're seeing. So take the time to do that. So rationale for the method of the procurement selected, that should be listed. For example, your contract file would not need to state why the contracting officer chose small purchase procedures to order a desk, but would want to note why non-competitive proposals were used for a roofing contract. The solicitation itself should be in there. The selection of contract pricing arrangement, but only if it's not apparent. For example, the contract file would not need to document why a firm fixed price was used to obtain building materials. It's a given. Now, documentation on your micro purchases. If competitive quotations are solicited and award is made to other than the low quote, you need to document to support that purchase. Maybe limited to identification of the solicited vendors and a brief explanation is why you made that decision to give that award. But give the rationale and always, try to remember that you might not be there to explain that file. It could be 3 years down the road, 4 years down the road, depending on, when your auditor is. They generally go back. You're supposed to keep your stuff for a minimum of 3 years, okay? But when you go in and there's like a final, or I say a final, a HUD monitoring visit, what'll happen is they'll look at usually like a 2-year period, the previous 2-year period. But during that search of those 2-year period, if something doesn't add up or you're deficient in an area or whatever, they can go back further, and they do. So make sure that your documents could be understood by the your head maintenance guy if he was to read them. Make them in a readable format. So they're self-explanatory, I guess you would say. Your documentation's supposed to be kept at a minimum. You need to retain your information supporting the purchases, paper or electronic, to the minimum extent and duration needed for your management review purposes, tracking, purchasing activity, etc. These will hopefully explain the extent to which quotation information should be recorded. So if you're doing an oral solicitation, your contracting officer should establish and maintain records of your oral price quotations. Hopefully you guys went in and looked at some of that material in the links, because there was documents that hopefully you could use if you don't have them. Yours might be a lot better. I don't know what you have, but it's good always to have different examples and, build and marry the best of the two. So, the contracting officer should establish and maintain records of oral price quotations sufficient to reflect clearly the propriety of placing that order at the price that you paid with that particular vendor. And in most cases, this effort will consist merely of showing the names of the vendors you contacted, the prices they quoted, and the other terms and conditions quoted by each. When it's a written solicitation, limit the written records of solicitation or offers to notes or abstracts that show the prices, delivery references, references to printed price list used, which vendors you actually contacted, and other pertinent information. In special situations, you include additional statements. When in doubt, put more in there, it says a minimum. I kind of disagree with that to a point. Cover your butt, get it all in there. Explaining the absence, I guess I should, you're 6, how's that? Explaining the absence of competition, and if only one sole source is solicited, in that case, you document. Supporting the award decision if other than the price related to factors were considered in selecting the vendor. Again, this is why we made that selection. They offered us this. They have a history with 8 housing entities. All other bidders have never audited an Indian housing agency, something like that. But make sure it's written out so they can understand that. Quotations for small purchases may be obtained in writing, hard copy or email, orally by fax, by catalog, letter, through electronic means, the internet, through paid advertisement, displaying the solicitation in a public place. The method should be appropriate for the purchase. Obtaining price quotes by phone for a commercially available supply item. And your housing entity can establish in their procurement policies dollar thresholds or other requirements for the use of written and oral solicitations. So think about that when you're reviewing your policy. Do you want to put in those thresholds and things? Written solicitations are used when it's necessary to provide vendors with detailed information that you can't convey orally by phone, or with detailed quotation and evaluation information. Your contracting officer should determine the best method given whichever procurement situation you're in. Now, suspension and debarment. Suspension is a temporary measure. They're only allowed to suspend a contractor basically for a 12-month limit, usually pending the completion of an investigation or the legal proceedings. Based upon adequate evidence, usually an indictment, they could actually debar them. And if they debar them, it's usually a 3-year period in length. Has to be based upon the preponderance of the evidence, usually a conviction. So if you want to read, in accordance with 24 CFR 1000, you'd go to 44. And in addition to any other tribal requirements which you might have in place, the prohibition described in 2 CFR Part 2424 on the use of debarred, suspended, or ineligible contractors apply. So, debarment, an exclusion from participation in all federally funded programs for a reasonable, specified period of time, commensurate with the seriousness of the violation or failure to perform on other contracts. Such action is taken pending the elimination of circumstances for which that debarment was imposed. It can be imposed for a violation of a contract clause, including equal employment opportunity provisions, acceptance of contingent fees, any of the Secretary of Labor regulations, such as Davis-Bacon, or any other serious contract violations. The Secretary of Labor may independently of HUD debar a firm based on violations of labor standards. Now, in my 28 years at a housing office, I had a contractor that was used off and on throughout the tribe for ICDBG and my work. And all of a sudden, 2 of his foremen walked in the door and said he wasn't paying us Davis-Bacon every time that we were on the reservation. Well, we used to go, certify those payrolls. They were very aware of who we were. That's why they knew who to even come to. You get the Department of Labor is suddenly involved. All the payrolls have to come out. All of your records have to come out. And should that contractor have not paid Davis-Bacon in all the cases when he should have, they might debar him, and then you don't use them again. As a matter of fact, we did not even. We don't want you to bid on anything. We're not going to take any bids until this is all over. But that's when you want your records in a row. What was really good is because we used to go interview them all the time. I said, hey, when you're on the res, keep a log. My guys, my maintenance keep a log, what they did, what day, and where they were at. You guys should do the same thing. These guys had those logbooks. They were on the reservation for this day doing this type of work on this site. So it made it a lot easier on the Department of Labor because it wasn't just the housing entity, it was the tribe. There's certain times that you don't always pay Davis-Bacon, not as a housing entity, but as a tribe or other entity. Just because you're on the reservation doesn't necessarily mean that all your contractors will have that. So it's very, very important to keep really, really good records. And sometimes, suspension and debarment is what turns out if those contractors don't do things correctly. So your suspensions are for a temporary period pending the completion of an investigation and such legal proceedings that might ensue. So SAM is the System for Award Management. That's what it's called. It's a federal government owned and operated free website that consolidates the capabilities in the Central Contractor Registration, a CCR. online representations, certifications, ORCA, excluded parties list. So that's where you go to identify your basically excluded firms. So the exclusions are areas within the performance and information functional areas of a system for awards management, which they call SAM. Used to be called the Excluded Parties List System, EPLS. Identifies parties that are excluded from receiving federal contracts. So when you your money, certain subcontracts and certain types of federal financial and non-financial assistance and benefits. As exclusion records are publicly available, SAM keeps the user community aware of administrative and statutory exclusions across the entire government and individuals barred from entering the United States. The more commonly used terms for suspensions and debarments reflects those exclusions. So how do you check to see whether an entity is excluded from receiving federal awards? This came from the SAM exclusions extract, the user guide. Use the following steps to see if an entity is subject to any active exclusions, suspensions, debarments imposed by a federal agency. You go to http://sam.gov. On the home page or the search record tab, you type the entity's name or the DUNS number in the search bar and you click on that search icon. Individuals are not signed DUNS numbers. If you are checking for an exclusion for an individual, you search by typing in the name. If no exclusion record is found for the entity does not have an active exclusion submitted in SAM by a federal agency. If an exclusion record is found, it will display in a box marked exclusion in purple. Check the status on the top right corner of that box. If the status indicates active, there's an active exclusion for that entity. Just seeing that an entity has an active exclusion is not sufficient. As an awarding official, you're supposed to continue on to the next steps. If you're viewing an exclusion record, as indicated by that purple marked exclusion in that upper left corner, on the search result, click View Details to open the exclusion record and see the additional information. If you're viewing an entity management record, as indicated by a green box marked entity in the upper left-hand corner of the search result, click View Details to view the entity's dashboard for more information. Use the navigation links on the left side of the screen to review the entity's specific exclusion. Click on the Active Exclusions link to view all current exclusions. Click on View Exclusion to view the data in the specific exclusion record. Scroll through the exclusion record to review details. For more information, refer to the System for Awards Management at www.sam.gov. There's also all sorts of YouTube videos with instructions on how to do this, because anybody spending any federal money has to take these steps to make sure that they check. Are we good? Okay, native preference. This is my uncle, guys. I lost him on the 4th of July. So we have native preference and Indian preference. They are actually two different things. In accordance with Section 101K of NAHASDA, a recipient shall apply the tribal employment and contract preference laws, including regulations and tribal ordinances adopted by your tribe that receives the benefit of funds granted to the recipient under NAHASDA. In the absence of tribal employment and contract preference laws, a recipient must, to the greatest extent feasible, give preference in the award of contracts for projects funded under this part to Indian organizations, Indian-owned economic enterprises, in accordance with Section 7B of the Indian Self-Determination Act. When it comes down to Indian preference, besides for like environmental records, everything is pretty much in those three books. It's within the NAHASDA statute, it's within the CFR 1000, or it's under the 200 book. There's a couple extra and places that you would have to look for certain things, but not many. Most everything are within our 3 books, as I call them. Native American preference falls under that category. That's actually under the education assistance. It's under that Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. So Section 7B provides that any contract, subcontract, grant, subgrant entered into for the benefit of a Native American or an Alaskan Native shall require, to the greatest extent feasible, that we give preference and opportunities for training and employment in connection with the administration of such contracts to Native Americans and Alaskan Natives. Preference in the awarded contracts or subcontracts in connection with the administration of contracts be given to Indian organizations and to Native-owned economic enterprises, as defined in Section 3 of the Indian Financing Act. So, implementing Native preference in procurement. Indian preference may be applied, not maybe, excuse me. I gotta have a drink here. Boy, was that awful. Must be applied. Indian preference must be applied to all purchases made with IHBG funds. Indian preference does not require that all purchases be made from a Native American or owned firm. It only means that there must be a system in place for giving that preference. The following are the applicable regulations for implementing preference. So, back to that act, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. A lot of you are probably very familiar with Public Law 93-638 if you're a 638 tribe. Authorized under the Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and some other governmental agencies to enter into contracts with and make grants directly to federally recognized Indian tribes. Now, federally, you kind of pay attention to that because state recognized Indian tribes are actually treated a little different. The tribes would have the authority for how they administer the funds, which give them greater control over their welfare. Preference in the award of subcontracts and subgrants in connection with the administration of such contracts or grants shall be given to your Indian organizations and Indian-owned economic enterprises as defined within Section 3 of the Indian Financing Act of 1974. And some of you will say Section 3 does not apply anymore, but we'll hear more. Your Indian preference final rule, it was amended, 24 CFR sections 1048, 50, and 52 all speak to that. So you would grab your book and that's where you would read. The guidance, the still active guidance is found under 2013-07R, it's called. It's the Indian and Tribal Preferences in Employment and Contracting. That's the guidance you would look at to read more on that. Provides additional information on administering those revisions. This has to do with tribal preference in employment and contracting. So there's what they call a NAHASDA procurement caveat. Part 200, that was produced for us. The regulations apply in connection with any federally funded project. NAHASDA procurement differs from Part 200 in a few respects, including providing for tribal preference. So this is kind of like what your sample thing would look. List your tribe's name. Bay Mills tribal preference to supersede Indian preference, permitting tribal prevailing wage rates, determinations to supersede Davis-Bacon, and permitting alternatives to construction bonds. The Part 200 regulations provide that program-specific regulations, the NAHASDA regulations, trump the Part 200 regulations. Bay Mills Tribe preference applies only to construction projects funded under NAHASDA or the Self-Determination Act. So that's when you would not have to pay Davis-Bacon, when you have tribal preference laws adopted by your tribe. The tribal action, you have to pass and adopt a law, code regulation regarding your tribal preference. Your entity adopts the policies, you put it in your personnel, your procurement, all your policies regarding preference. Actually, that even goes in your, your hiring policies. Such law or policy can provide for preferential treatment over, okay, I'm a Bay Mills Indian. My husband is a Sioux tribe. They call it Sioux Tribe of Chippewa Indians. We're the same band. We're different tribes. His is 20 miles away. Their reservation is 25 miles from here. We may and do put a policy in effect saying we will hire all Bay Mills Indians before we will hire any other native. That allows you to give preference over any other native. So if you have this action adopted, such law or policy can provide preferential treatment over other Indians that are not members of your tribe in employment and contracting, in reductions in workforce and layoffs. So you can also say a Bay Mills member will be the last person laid off of that position, regardless of when they're hired. You can write those preference laws, to reduce first in, last out. So, what Indian preference requirements apply to our Indian Housing Block Grant procurement? So, in accordance with Section 101 of NAHASDA, the recipient shall apply the tribal employment and contract preference laws, including regulations, your tribal ordinances adopted by your tribe that receives the benefit from funds granted to the recipients under NAHASDA. In the absence of tribal employment and contract preference laws, a recipient must, to the greatest extent feasible, give preference in the award of contracts for projects funded under this part to Indian organizations and Indian-owned economic enterprises in accordance with Section 7B of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act. You certify you have your policies and procedures, and you go to 1052 to learn about those. Preference clauses have to be incorporated into your contracts, and you include Indian preference references in all your notices and your advertisements. It provides special opportunities for your Indian contractors and selection. It mandates additional preferences that contractors must offer Indian laborers, subcontractors, suppliers, economic opportunities for Indians and the tribes, the recipients in your communities. You are not required to hire an Indian individual or firm. You have to make sure that you have the mechanisms, to give preference. So preferences in your solicitation process. It's required by federal and oftentimes your tribal law. You clarify preference standards within your procurement policy. You clarify the preference standards from the outset of any type of bidding documents that you put out. Indian preference is different from other preferences. It's not racially or affirmative action based. It's not a political status, so your recipient tribes or tribal members, and it actually arises under different federal laws. My tribe actually went into the marijuana business. Has a big, I think it's the first Indian-owned dispensary and whatever. And when they started hiring and filling and starting that startup, they broadcast all over. They're looking for this type of person and this type of, and put all the Indian preference in. Boy, I was amazed in Facebook and different areas reading all the things. How are they allowed to discriminate and things like that? So people that don't have experience in the procurement world sometimes don't understand that we are allowed to offer Indian preference. So you need to kind of learn about it so you can explain it, because you probably will have to at one time. So Indian preference, where is it applied? You apply it in the selection of contractors and vendors, in the contractor selection of subcontractors and suppliers during employment and training by contractors. You specifically determine if the individuals and entities are qualified. You have to be qualified to get Indian preference. And you never ever rely on determinations and certifications made by someone else. If my husband's tribe 25 miles away was to certify somebody as giving them Indian preference, the 51% ownership and all of the rules that apply, I would still make that determination myself. You can't. And you can change it right up to the last, because there's a lot of organizations that aren't what they appear to be. So who's eligible for that preference? Members of a federally recognized tribe. Doesn't say state, guys. Federally recognized tribes themselves. You can offer your tribe, preference. They have to be 51% owned and controlled by such members of that tribe. 51% ownership and control. Control includes voting rights, management, decision-making, allocation of profits. The entity owned by a tribe or a tribal member must show evidence of that ownership and control. It's been done in the past and across the United States where they'll pick up a native and say, hey, and they're their token owner so they can get that special preference or that difference in the bid amounts, or make sure that it's actually an Indian owned or ran company. That preference has to be requested. You advise all your bidders and your proposers and vendors that the Indian preference is required in your contracting and in your awards. Parties seeking preference must request that preference. When feasible, provide interested parties with an Indian preference qualification application. There's ways to determine eligibility. There's a variety of approaches based on the size, the regularity, the nature of your procurement. The more thorough the process, the better. On a large procurement, make the determination prior to the submission of the bid or proposal. Pre-qualify your firms. Shall include a determination that the bidder is a responsible contractor. Remember, responsive and responsible. You're always checking those two things. Indian preference required documents. You need an Indian preference policy. You need Indian preference qualification applications. You need Indian preference determination letters. You need a procedure, complaints policy for methods of providing for Indian preference. So make sure you have all of these documents. I think I give you samples for all of them. So this is a sample part of that policy, Section 7B of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act. All preferences shall be publicly announced in the IFB and the RFP at the bidding or proposal documents. Efforts to provide Indian preference must be documented. If Indian preference is not feasible, the tribe shall document in writing the basis of its finding of infeasibility and maintain that documentation for 3 years after the end of the program year in which they expended those funds. So I'm not going to read you the whole policy. I'm quite sure that it's within our documents. This is the sample that's within the documents. Like I said, when I write, it's any tribal Indian housing entity. It's the Indian preference qualification application. John Doe hereby submits to the Bay Mills tribe the following application seeking to qualify as 51% or more Indian owned and controlled economic enterprise or tribal organization. So it can be eligible for Indian preference in Bay Mills selection and award of contracts, subcontracts, employment, and training. This application must be submitted in a timely manner and a date prescribed by Bay Mills, blah, 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 in order for the applicant to be considered eligible for Indian preference. So I think it's a 6-page form, but it's in your documents. So you also, just like your applications, you have to say yep or no. We accept you or we reject you, basically. So this is your determination document, and there's a sample of that in there also. It's a determination on request for Indian preference. Any tribal Indian housing authority has made the following general contracting pre-qualification determination for Bay Mills Housing Authority and has asked me to communicate this decision to you. Pre-qualification would entitle you to Indian preference in our bid letting and award of general construction contracts on projects. In order to qualify for this preference, we had to determine that you satisfied each of our requirements, and it's a qualified or a disqualified form. I think that's a 2-page form, but that's in there also. Indian preference complaint procedure. You need this also within your documents and your policies. So what procedures apply to complaints arising out of any of the methods of providing for Indian preference? The following procedures are applicable to complaints arising out of any of the methods for providing for Indian preference contained in this part, including alternate methods. Tribal policies that meet or exceed the requirements of this selection shall apply. Each complaint shall be in writing, signed, and filed with you as the recipient. A complaint must be filed with the recipient no later than 20 calendar days from the date of the action or omission upon which that complaint is based. Upon receipt of a complaint, the recipient shall promptly stamp the date and time the receipt upon the complaint and immediately acknowledge its receipt. Within 20 calendar days of receipt of the complaint, the recipient shall either meet or communicate by mail, telephone, with the complainant in an effort to resolve that matter. The recipient shall make a determination on the complaint and notify the complainant in writing within 30 calendar days of the submittal of the complaint to the recipient. The decision of the recipient shall constitute final and administrative action of the complaint. So you make sure you have all those documents put there. You'll be asked for them. You should, well, most auditors don't ask for all your policies, but if you have HUD monitoring, they will. So when feasible, you use that Indian preference qualification application, requires supporting documentation. Establish a panel of 3 staff or board members to evaluate and decide eligibility. I don't know if we're going to hit on this tomorrow, but you need an evaluation panel of at least 3 people. Remember, we kind of discussed it over the week. Some people, maybe a lawyer, like I said, somebody with your building background. It's important that you have a really good evaluation panel. They don't need to be purely your staff. Use some of your tribal council, use some of the tribal staff, for that panel. You could give them a subsidy or feed them or whatever you have to do, but you're going to need a good evaluation panel at some point. Probably a couple of times a year. So get a good one together and use the same one. Use them for your Indian preference the same way you do as evaluating your other criteria. Make an independent verification and inquiry. Like they said, do not, just because they were approved by a different tribe does not mean that you have to approve them. Common fronting practices disguise how little profit the tribe or that member actually receives. The Indian tribe or member appears on paper as 51% owner, but management and control are basically with a non-Indian. Less than truthful in explaining resources that each owner brings to an entity. Document. Carefully record decision in writing, make a brief decision, be prepared to give and provide further explanation to anybody that you should disqualify. And make sure, this is an important part, if you disqualify a party, they can still submit a bid or a proposal. They're just not going to receive the Indian preference. Make sure that they realize that. Reserve the right to reconsider. Reserve the right to disqualify anyone, even if you have already qualified them, right up until the award of your contract, in case you become aware of new information and or the entity's structure should suddenly change. You can add contract provisions for the termination if the entity loses its Indian ownership or control all of a sudden during your contract period. 24 CFR 1052 The TDHC certifies that they have a policy which will afford Indian preference consistent with ISDEA 25 USC 450 EB. Now I feel like a NASCAR. Shell, Coca-Cola, no, or solicit bids from the Indian owned and controlled entity only, or you can use a two-stage method. I'll give you more on that. So the two-stage method, you solicit statements of intent from Indian owned and controlled entities. If you get two or more that are received from qualified entities, responsible, responsive, all that too, then you can solicit bids and proposals from Indian owned and controlled entities only. That's your call. Otherwise, you solicit bids and proposals from all entities using your established method of applying Indian preference. Applying Indian preference. If any method of Indian preference results in only one bid or proposal being received, then you re-advertising used any approved method of your Indian preference under A, or re-advertise to all entities using an X factor or other points for preference, or you ask EWONAP for an approval. You have to justify that and get that in writing if you're going to do that one though, guys. Remember that. Get it in writing. So this is what's called the X factor. An optional method can be utilized for implementing native preference requirements of 24 CFR 1052. Under that method, the award shall be made under unrestricted solicitations to the lowest responsive bidder from a qualified Indian-owned economic enterprise or organization within the maximum total contract price established for that specific project or activity being solicited. If the bid is no more than X higher than the total bid price for the lowest responsive bid from any qualified bidder, the X factor is determined as followed. And this is the ratio. This would have to be contained within your procurement policy. This is the exact one that's in the sample that HUD gets out. Any questions on that? Okay, this is Canada. Those are all windmills over there. Procurement principles and standards. Section 3, remember I told you Section 3 is kind of strange, of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 provides that preference in employment and contracting shall be given to low-income persons. Per 1042, NAHASDA recipients meet the Section 3 requirements when they comply with employment and contract preference laws adopted by their tribe in accordance with Section 101K of NAHASDA, giving preference in employment and contracting to tribal members. So that's one thing that you should find out, first of all, because I found this in different findings actually that I was called upon to correct after some HUD monitoring visits. Like I said, I do a lot of that. I go in and try to help people either prepare, or on the other side, after they've already had their monitoring, help them try to fix and get the training needed, or whatever, some of their findings. Well, Section 3 kind of plays in there a lot. I was still surprised. But do you have a preference in employment and contracting? Do you have that as one of your tribal documents? That's something you should find out. So Section 3, recipients are required to comply with Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. Section 3 addresses job training, employment, contracting opportunities for low-income individuals. It can be addressed in your personnel and your procurement policies. You find that requirement at 1042. So then, all of a sudden, I thought Section 3 no longer applies, because on October 23rd, 2020, there was a Dear Tribal Leader letter that was issued. The Dear Tribal Leader letter, Section 3, was October 23rd of 2020. It's the Section 3 final rule. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development published a final rule entitled Enhancing and Streamlining the Implementation of Section 3 Requirements for Creating Economic Opportunities for Low and Very Low Income Persons and Eligible Businesses. As you know, Section 3 of HUD 1968 requires recipients of certain HUD funds make economic opportunities available for low and very low income individuals, especially recipients of government assistance for housing, living in areas where HUD funds are spent. The Section 3 final rule makes changes to the Section 3 regulations, now codified in 24 CFR Part 75 and effective November 30th of 2020. Designed to focus on economic opportunity outcomes while simultaneously reducing our regulatory burden. These changes improve the effectiveness of Section 3, streamline some processes that have not yielded significant benefits, and encourage HUD grantees to focus on sustained employment for low and very low income individuals. The Section 3 final rule does impact our Native American programs in important ways that I wanted to share with you. This is them writing, not me, by the way. The final rule provides that contracts, subcontracts, subgrants, subject to the Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, subject to tribal preference requirements as authorized under 101K of NAHASDA, must provide preferences in employment, training, business opportunities to Indians and Indian organizations, and are therefore not subject to the requirements of 24 Part 75. Accordingly, beginning on November 30th, 2020, the effective date of the Section 3 final rules, tribes and tribally designated housing entities will no longer be required to comply with Section 3 requirements. Additionally, the final rule makes confirming technical changes to the Indian Housing Block Grant, clarifying that recipients are no longer subject to Section 3 requirements. So I thought, oh, good, we don't have to pay attention to another rule. Easier for us. So then you get into your APR. Section 3 of the APR. There was a tribe that I was helping, and one of their findings read, if the tribe has not adopted a tribal preference policy and has projects or activities that exceed 200,000 or more in HUD funds, it has to submit a completed Section 3 summary report describing employment, training, contracting opportunities provided to very low income persons as required by whatever. So guys, make sure you have a tribal preference policy in hiring and employment. And then when you get to this part of your section 3 of your APR, you won't have to fill it out. So, are the requirements of Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act applicable? Tribal preference recipients meet the Section 3 requirements when they comply with employment and contract preference laws adopted by their tribe in accordance with Section 101K of NAHASDA. So, bottom line, guys, make sure you have tribal preference, employment and contract preference laws adopted by your tribe. It'll save you time in the future. Any questions on that? This is a lighthouse about 3 miles from my house. So price and contract analysis, independent cost estimates. There's estimates out everywhere, isn't there? Is proposed price fair and reasonable? So prior to awarding that contract, now you have to determine if that proposed price is fair and reasonable. It's accomplished by performing a cost or a price analysis prior to your contract award. The type of analysis is going to depend on the method of procurement that you used and the estimated dollar value of the contract. Cost refers to how much the contractor will have to pay to perform the contract. Price refers to how much the contractor will charge to perform the contract. Profit is what is left over after the contractor has paid all of its cost. Price analysis is the most common technique for evaluating the price of a procurement. Price analysis is a review and evaluation of a proposed price without evaluating separate cost elements. Cost analysis is a review and evaluation of the separate elements of costs that make up a contractor's cost proposal. Cost and profit equal your price. How does cost and price analysis apply to different procurement methods? So when it's small purchase, when using small purchase method of procurement, price analysis is conducted by obtaining price or rate quotes from an adequate number of qualified sources, comparing the quotes and the rates to prior purchases of a similar nature. The situations are typical of many procurements and do not require a more formal cost analysis. Sealed bidding. Purchase of supplies, equipment, construction are typically accomplished using sealed bidding. Sealed bidding is mandatory for the procurement of equipment, supplies, services, construction that exceeds that 250,000 threshold. The reasonableness of the price is established by, again, a comparison of independent cost estimate and the competitive bids received. No further price analysis is required. However, cost analysis is required in certain situations when only one bid is received. You don't like the one bid scenario, though. Competitive proposals are most often used when acquiring professional consulting, architects, engineers, and A&E services. In order to determine the reasonableness of cost under these types of contracts, your contracting officer will need to ask the offerers to submit the elements of their cost, i.e. cost breakdown. As such, the contracting officer should perform a cost analysis and will need to apply the cost principles. Non-competitive proposals. If procurement by a non-competitive proposal has been justified under one of the circumstances listed under 2 CFR 200.320, no cost analysis is required for the effort of trying to determine cost reasonableness. According to 200.320, procurement by non-competitive proposals is procurement through solicitation of a proposal from only one source and may be used only when one or more of the following circumstances apply. And you guys know all those because we went through them, but I'm pounding it in your head so you don't get in trouble. The item is available from only one place. It's a public emergency or exigency. HUD gives you permission in writing. Ask for solicitation of a number of sources. Competition is determined inadequate. So you guys know when you can only do it that way. Price versus cost. Cost analysis is needed when the elements of the cost, let's say professional consulting, AE services contracts. You're doing a non-competitive proposal method. After soliciting, you only get that one bid or a change order to the contract affecting the price. Price analysis is used in all other instances, usually to determine reasonableness of the proposed contract price. Cost analysis techniques. You do that independent cost estimate before you receive the bids and proposals. Verify pricing, evaluate your cost proposals, including necessary and the reasonableness of the cost. Technical appraisals, by an engineer. Application of correct indirect cost rates, direct labor rates, all that. Evaluate fair and reasonable profit. Just make sure it's kosher. Cost analysis techniques. Compare contractor cost against actual cost if it's the same contractor. Previous cost estimates from the same firm or other same or similar items. Technique to be used to perform the work. Are costs consistent with the proposed approach? Again, found under 2 CFR 200.323, you must perform that cost and price analysis for sealed bids, competitive proposals, non-competitive proposals. Procurement in excess of your simplified acquisition threshold, including contract changes. Method varies with your cost and your factors. Cost analysis is encouraged for micro and small purchases. Must at least document that you deem it that amount reasonable. You should start with an ICE before your bids or proposals, and cost estimates are not disclosed. That's confidential information. When do you do them? Cost or price analysis is required, above your simple acquisition threshold. Not required, but it should be reasonable if it falls into the other category underneath it. Is it reasonable? Compare proposed prices received in response to the solicitation. Compare past prices and contracts for the same or similar items. Services, apply yardsticks, price per square foot, price per pound, other units, to find those differences. Compare competitive pricing list, cost estimating publications, published market prices, etc. So what is a price analysis? It's essentially price comparison. It is the evaluation of a proposed price, i.e. lump sum, without analyzing any of the separate cost elements that it's composed of. What is a cost analysis? It's the evaluation of the separate elements, labor, materials, etc., to make up a contractor's total cost proposal or price for both new contracts and modifications to determine if they're allowable, directly related to the requirement, and ultimately reasonable. Is it always required, that cost or that price analysis? HUD's regulations, yes, require that grantees perform a cost or a price analysis for every procurement action, including contract modifications, change orders, using your HUD grant funds. When do you perform a price analysis? You use a price analysis whenever you're comparing lump sum prices, not cost estimates, received from contractors in a competitive pricing situation when sealed bids are obtained. What qualifies as competition? Generally, competition means two or more responsible, i.e. not debarred or suspended, offerers or bidders, competing independently, submit priced offers that satisfy your grantee's contract requirements. Obviously, the greater number of offerers received, the greater the competition, and ideally the better pricing. They oftentimes say two. I used to always say, get me three. That, I don't know. That might have just been I don't want to use the word I was going to use to describe myself, but I always wanted three. When do I perform that cost analysis? It's used whenever you do not have a price competition. A cost analysis is required using the competitive proposal or negotiated method of contracting for acquiring professional consulting, architects, engineers, A&E services. Under that competitive proposal method, offerers are required to submit cost proposals that show what their elements are, their labor, material, overhead, profit, other proposed cost or price. Negotiating a contract with a sole source, not soliciting competitive bids or offers. When a sole source is appropriate and justified, you still have to obtain a complete cost breakdown from the sole source contractor and perform an analysis using your cost principles to establish a fair and reasonable price and estimated cost. After soliciting competitive sealed bids, you receive only one bid, and it differs substantially from your independent contract, your ICE, your estimate, your contact price. If you determine that that bid is unreasonable and decide to not recompete, market survey tells you that you would not get competition, then you can formally cancel that solicitation and negotiate a contract price with that single bidder. In that case, you must obtain a cost breakdown of the single bid price and use cost principles too after soliciting that competitive sealed bid. And I get usually a lawyer and HUD involved in anything like that. Negotiating a modification includes change orders, including change orders, I'm sorry, to any type of a contract. If the modification changes the work authorized under the contract and changes the price of total estimated cost, either upwards or downwards, you must obtain a detailed breakdown of that contractor's proposed cost, not a lump sum proposal, before negotiating that change in that contract price. Caution, modifications that change the work beyond the scope of your contract must be justified. If the out of scope change cannot be justified, you should be procuring that work. You must procure that work competitively. I used to tell them that when I put something out for bids, and especially if I had a pre-bid meeting or whatever, don't come to me with the change orders unless I'm initiating it. I don't like change orders. My tribe was terrible like that, building its casinos and stuff. It probably, I don't know. They paid way more than they should have on their construction. They needed somebody a little bit harder in that realm. I don't like change orders. So I've got a couple questions. Put it in the chat box, see if we can get a couple answers. I'll split this up so you'll see it a little bit better. The Elk Mountain Tribe received a low bid from Ace Sand and Gravel in the amount of $245,000 for gravel to be used in their construction project. They estimated it was going to run about $260,000. Is a cost or a price analysis required? Why or why not? And then I'm going to come back and ask you another one, but I'll repeat it later. After entering into a contract and starting work, they submitted a change order in the amount of $20,000 due to a change in the scope of work. Is a cost or a price analysis required? Why or why not? So, any answers about the Elk Mountain Tribe received a low bid from Ace Sand and Gravel in the amount of $245,000 for the gravel. They estimate it would be $260,000. Is a cost or a price analysis required? Anybody? Yes, no, maybe? And why or why not? Am I getting any answers? I can't see. Are you there? Hello? Oh no. Are you there?
Hello? Yeah.
Oh, good.
No, no,
You
no.
know,
I'm
this
here.
is
I'm here.
that's my ongoing nightmare, that I'm teaching a class and teaching for an hour along the way, and that I lost you and did not know.
No, no, no.
That's what
We
you
do
just
have
had
an
me
answer in
panic.
the chat. Susan says, yes, estimated simplified acquisition threshold.
Okay. You had me completely panicked.
No,
No.
I'm right here.
But they must show the amount was reasonable, and the way to prove that is usually a price analysis. So it's not required, but you're supposed to show it's reasonable, and that's the way you usually do it, is with the price analysis. Okay, so the second part is, after entering into that contract and starting work, they submitted a change order in the amount of $20,000. Due to a change in the scope of work, is a cost or a price analysis required? Why or why not? Got any answers?
No answer still.
No answers? Do I just give them the answer then?
They're down the road. My personal preference is I would rather come and do it in person. If you guys are having it, I really enjoy it.
Somebody's mic's
Okay,
open.
we have yes over the threshold, Joy says, and now Susan says yes, the total puts the contract over the simplified acquisition threshold.
Okay. According to 2 CFR 200-323, a cost or price analysis is only required for procurements above the simplified acquisition threshold, currently $250,000, unless you haven't updated your procurement policy. However, that price must be reasonable, and an estimate must be made to determine if that procurement falls into that category. So, good job, guys. So, I guess that's about it for today. See you tomorrow. Do we have any more questions? If not, thank you guys for everything you've done. There's my information. This is the part that I'm afraid I'm always going to lose you. There we go. Okay. Anything?
Okay, it seems like we don't have any questions in the chat. So
Okay.
I'm going to
See you guys all tomorrow. come back for the last day.
I'm going to do the closing. If you guys haven't done so already, please do complete our survey. I know a couple of you have been completing it during the week. So please, please, please do complete that survey for us. It lets us know how we're doing and any other things that you would want us to produce and whatnot. There we go. I put the link in the chat. And tomorrow is the last day of this virtual training. So please, we hope to see you
Thank you,
again
James.
tomorrow. The recording will be on YouTube. So sometime next week, hopefully, and every other virtual training we've done is on our YouTube channel as well. And please do check out all of our upcoming events on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Twitter, and our Hobo Thing of podcast. We've been working a lot to record some awesome stuff for you guys. So you can listen to us on Spotify, Google Podcast, and Apple Podcast. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and we hope to see you guys tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye, Cheryl.
And that's her NASCAR announcement. No, no.